I won't talk for very long because that's what Louise is here to do. Louise, if people aren't aware, is a writer, activist, and historian with a strong background in the trade union movement. She's worked for more than 20 years on bringing the true significance of the Brighton and May Matchwomen's strike of 1888 to public awareness. She's well, I've done a lot, I suppose, with a real determination to bring this vital story of workers' victories to light, and that's led to an MA and a PhD. And a book, Strike and Light, which you can't see it because of the thing. I've got a copy of it on the shelf behind me somewhere. Is in its 5th reprint, and she's a regular history contributor on BBC Radio London and on BBC. So welcome, Louise. Thank you for your time. If you're okay to speak anywhere between 30 and 45 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Just shout at me when you get bored in case I go on a bit. Thank you very much, Phil.
And then we'll do questions and answer afterwards.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, a bit flustered. Just made it. I've been teaching in London and I just got home, and the trains, of course the trains are always late, aren't they? If they know you've got to get home for something, I think it's always the way. But I'm here now and lovely to be with you all. And thank you so much for letting me come along and share the story of the Matchwomen. Someone once said to me, the way you teach working class history, you treat it like it's some kind of troublemaker's handbook. And they didn't say it in a good way, but I took that as a massive compliment because, yes, history is not, for us, particularly as trade unionists, this is not something that is dead and gone. These are not nice little safe stories of the past. These are people just like us with our same issues in the past, and their stories can tell us what we can do now with the same problems that we face. And it's interesting, actually, as a historian, particularly of the Victorian period, because we are going backwards, aren't we? I don't want to be negative. I mean, I always like to be positive, but we are somewhat going backwards, I think it's fair to say, in terms of poverty, in terms of the conditions that we're facing and living in. So pretty appropriate to go back to 1888. So what I discovered, and I started researching the Matchwomen, I'd left school at 15. I was very much not an academic, but I was a trade unionist. And it was on a labour history course that I first started looking at the Matchwomen's strike and started looking at it, to be honest, because I think they were about the only women that were mentioned on the course, not the fault of the tutors at all, the fault of establishment history, the fault of the way that we like to teach history in this country, which is very much the great and good. Still, isn't it? Top down, great individuals can change things, but you little people sit quietly and behave and wait for the great and good to get round to you because you can't change anything. And the Matchwomen taught me so much. They really, really educated me. Through them, I opened the door really to a kind of Aladdin's cave of history that I never knew existed. I was brought up with kings and queens history and a bit of crop rotation. I suppose it was the peasants rotating the crops. That was about as close as we got to working class history when I was at school, which is many, many moons ago. Things haven't changed as much as you might think. As much as we would like to think. History still isn't massively comfortable. Mainstream history is not massively comfortable with working class history. Still, with Black or Asian or Muslim or disabled or LGBT or socialist or trade unionist history, like you would be surprised, or perhaps you wouldn't be surprised actually, how hard it can be to smuggle these stories into the mainstream, to sneak them onto the BBC. I mean, obviously the first historians who could record history, going way back, were the only people who could read or write, so they were the elite. You can understand that. But now we should be a bit beyond that, shouldn't we? We should be, in the main, comfortable with the truth, which is that it's the 95% of us who've actually made the history of this country. It is not just the kings and the queens and the royals, but there are an awful lot of people who would like to just teach history like that. You remember when Michael Gove was Education Secretary, no mistake that he pushed history back to kings and queens and battles and dates, establishment history. Yes, Ella, people who could read or write was mostly men, but not always. It was women as well. But it was a very small elite class who were recording history. So no surprise that we don't get the working class take on it. So I found out when I discovered the incredible truths about a groundbreaking strike in 1888 by these women. If I can have the first slide, please, to my glamorous assistant. The Matchwomen who worked in East London in a match factory, obviously, which is why they're Matchwomen. I found out so much from them that I never knew, not just about women in history, but about trade union history. I was a trade unionist, but I suppose I thought and was taught that it was kind of a man's movement, that women were latecomers to the trade union movement. And my goodness, that was not true at all, as it turned out. The Matchwomen are so interesting because who they were, their background, their families, their friends, their identity, their own traditions, both made their victory possible and made it very hard to get into the mainstream consciousness. So I hit a lot of roadblocks when I became deeply obsessed with this story and started trying to do more with it than just write an essay on a Labour history course, because that is how it started, nearly 30 years ago. I thought, not knowing academia, that I could come forward with this story and go and talk to these wonderful people called historians who I was so in awe of because they'd written books and my God, they had degrees and they had PhDs. And I thought, somehow that they'd be delighted with me skipping forward and going, oh, hey, everybody, guess what? I've discovered a completely new take on history. And of course, they weren't at all, because I'd messed up some of their books, effectively. I'd messed up some of the ways that history had been taught. And it didn't go down as well as you thought it might have done. And part of that is because of who the Matchwomen were. So if we can have the second slide, please. Thank you very much. They were from that's it. Perfect. Thank you. Yes, Stan, hegemony. Exactly right. These were girls from the wrong side of the tracks. They're from the wrong side of town. They're from the East End. Oh, dreadful to be Victorian and from the Victorian East End. This is just awful. Because the East End is discriminated against. It's the home of disreputable poverty. But of course, we blame the people who live there for the conditions. Conditions are so bad, we start to other them, if you like. We can't really excuse the fact that so near to the centres of wealth and power, so near to the city, we have people starving and living in terrible conditions. So what do? Two choices, I suppose, aren't there? We can either improve conditions in the East End, bit expensive, or we can blame the people who live there. We can other them. We can say it's their fault. Their housing is like that. This housing was fine, and then these EastEnders, these wretched working class poor people, they moved into it and they've ruined it. And anyway, they like living like that. And you can guess, can't you? You can guess which one we do. They did. And you can guess because of your trade unionists and you have that political awareness, but you can also guess because it's still what we do now, isn't it? So I started to get the most incredible insights, really, from looking into their true story. But the story that I first came across didn't feature the Matchwomen as like really important movers and shakers. We were taught, because that's what historians had generally said, that their strike in 1888 was just a small harbinger of things to come, a kind of foreshadowing of the glorious harvest of 1889, the new unionism movement, the Great Dock Strike, the Gas Workers' Organisation, new waves of the most exploited workers, forcing unionisation, forcing employers to concede by going on strike, always dated from 1889. And I wondered about this because I thought, well, the Matchwomen, I didn't know much about them. There wasn't much in the books about them, a few lines in the history books. Well, they went on strike in 1888, right? And my maths isn't great. But if new unionism started in 1889, but they were striking first, weren't they the start of the movement? Like, that seemed a logical question. And I got a lot of pushback from academics about that. I used to present, when I was starting to do my master's degree, I used to present at academic conferences, and I would be told things like, well, Louise, you do get very enthusiastic, not being rude, but we can tell you're not really an academic. You don't really come from that background. You sound like you're addressing a trade union meeting. And I used to think, well, good, because my trade union members wouldn't let me get away with anything that was inaccurate. There's nothing wrong with addressing a trade union meeting. And people would say, because I've been a barmaid, people would say, yeah, we sort of can tell, you must remember that when you're addressing a conference, you're not behind the bar in the pub. I mean, I don't think I was going, do you want ice and lemon with that, or get out of my pub? But this was, by the way, Labour historians. So this is people who study working class history, and yet it was, just a little bit too much that I was coming forward and suggesting these ideas, or that's what it seemed to be. So when I said, if they went on strike first, aren't they the start of the movement? Oh, well, no, it's not your fault, but you don't come from academia and you don't really get it. They just sort of went on strike and they were made to go on strike. It doesn't really count. It wasn't really a proper strike. That's not until the dock strike. And I thought, well, okay, I suppose, but made to go on strike. So they're just puppets then. They're not going on strike on purpose, if you like. They're not going on strike from a genuine workers' cause. Well, I mean, if you say so, but that sounded really strange to me. And that's why I first started researching it and picked it for my little essay title, because I'd been on strike, and I'd been on strike with women from East End families, admittedly a century later, but this didn't make sense to me at all. The girls that I'd been on strike with were nobody's fools. Nobody was going to make them go on strike unless they really believed in it. I couldn't believe that people had changed that much. And also I couldn't see the practicality of it. Now, these were women living hand to mouth on very low wages, right? Starvation wages. They're working full time and they're malnourished. And yet I'm supposed to believe that they were led from the outside to go on strike with no strike funds, with no savings. Why? Why on earth would they do this? They would have to be complete idiots, wouldn't they? And completely manipulated. It made no sense. So all I knew was the few lines I'd read in other history books. This woman called Annie Besant, who was a journalist, had told them to go on strike, and so they had. And I thought, well, all right, I mean, it sounds odd to me, but I'll have a look, I'll study it. Let me research this. Let me see how Annie Besant did it, if indeed she did do it like that. Because great, I can learn from this woman, right? She must have had the most unbelievable rhetoric to make these women go out and strike. So let me see how she did it. And I went down in my lunch break to the first archive I'd ever encountered in cold blood. And that was in a little local library near where I was working in Islington. There was the archives of the company, Brighton May, long gone. The factory turned into what we used to call a yuppie flat. So I didn't have a clue how to research, didn't really know what you did in an archive, but they just brought me out box after box after box, and I just delved in. And there were papers in there from 1886, 1966. It was all just crammed in together in these huge boxes, these huge cardboard boxes. But two things leapt out at me really quickly. The first was there was a list in there, once I'd waded through everything, that the foreman in the factory had recorded. And it was, I call it the naughty list. It was a list of girls they believed were the ringleaders, right? The ones they thought had started the strike. And can I have slide 3? And I thought, well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Because this strike was supposedly forced on them by outsiders, and yet we've got ringleaders inside the factory. Well, that doesn't make any sense at all. And the other thing that leapt out at me was an article by the journalist Annie Besant, who is credited, or was credited for more than a century, for having led the Matchwomen strike. And she was a middle-class woman. She was very much not a Matchwoman, but because she was socialist-ish, the thought went, well, you know, Red's under the bed. She's definitely pushed these women into going on strike. But in this archive was not just the article Annie Besant had written about the Matchwomen, the one that everybody quotes, which was a brilliant expose, by the way, of conditions at Bryant and May, but the whole paper. So I read the whole newspaper, and there were other articles from her in there. And in one of them, in the same issue, Annie Besant, strike leader, supposedly rubbished the idea that workers like the Matchwomen could or should take strike action. She said, you know, they would just be sacked. What is the point? And she said, there's a mania at the moment, good Victorian word, there's a mania for organising the working classes, for trying to bring the lowest of the low, you know, the unorganised, the not the aristocrats of labour, not the men at the top of their skills and professions, not the men with the silk top hats, but the lowest workers, the lowest, quote unquote, the most exploited workers. There's a mania for bringing them out on strike, she said, but how ridiculous. Just not going to work, not going to happen. And she said, for women like the Match Girls, trade unionism might brighten their lives a little. I love that. I love the idea of trade unionism like a sort of makeover or a spa day with the girls. It might brighten their lives a little. But she said it couldn't do anything for them otherwise. It couldn't educate them politically. And I thought, blimey, well, alarm bells were ringing loudly in my head, because these were not the words of a woman preparing to lead a strike, right? And I started digging deeper. There wasn't a book about the strike until, as Phil very kindly mentions, I wrote mine. And what there was, very, very little, and all from the Annie Besant perspective. So the women weren't even named. They were just the Match Girls. So they were just this grey mass of women. Digging deeper, looking at every account I could, local papers, national papers, people's diaries, people's journals, anything that Annie Besant or anyone around the strike had published, I drew out a timeline. And I realised it was really clear that Annie Besant hadn't even known that the strike had started when it started. Well, I don't know what your experience is of organising strikes, but I would imagine you would know when a strike that you were involved in had started, right? That's kind of the baseline. If Annie Besant was a strike leader, she would surely know there was a strike. So, first of all, let's talk about the employers and who they were. If I can have the next slide, we can see the Match Factory, where they worked, which I don't know if anybody's from the East End or knows the East End, but this is on Fairfield Road in the heart of Bow. Now a gated community, very, very nice, bistro in there and a swimming pool and a lovely little shop. But then a huge factory site where the original Mr. Bryant and Mr. May, who were grocers, had moved in 1861 to try their hand at matchmaking. And how well did they do at matchmaking? Well, it was a low-cost trade to set up. It was really good because you needed timber, cheap, working class people, very, very cheap, and a bit of white phosphorus to dip the matches in, which was also fairly cheap. So it was a high profit and low investment industry. Let's see how well they did by the next generation, shall we? By the time of the strike, one of the directors, who was the son of the original Mr. Bryant, was living in, if we see the next slide, this little gaff. I think you'll agree it's all right. you know, I'm sure your place is a bit better. It's definitely mine is, she says, sitting in her crumbling flat. But look at this. This is Stoke Park. And it was on the market for 4 years. It was so expensive that even the millionaires of the Victorian period couldn't afford it until Mr. Bryant swooped in and bought it. So they felt by 1888, this firm, Bryant and May, absolutely unbeatable. They are so rich, they're practically the aristocracy. They're incredibly well in with the politicians of the day. Those of you, hi Steve, no problem, nice to see you. Those of you who are saying you live near the factory, you will know the statue on Bow Road of Gladstone. Well, that was built by Bryant and May to suck up to the Prime Minister of the day. Very, very well connected with the Liberal Party and the Liberal government. Exporters, factories all over the country. Bryant and May matches everywhere you look, on every street corner, in every pub. They are doing super well and they feel completely unassailable at this point. Great PR campaigns as well. They're really like modern fat cat capitalists. They're probably the first example of that, to do so well in this country. They're always having journalists round and you know, buttering them up and say, oh, so wonderful, look at the wonderful conditions. You know, they'd wheel out the one girl who was sort of still alive and wasn't completely malnourished, and have her say, oh, I love working for Bryant and May. So doing really, really well. But it all went wrong for them PR wise when they tried to bully the wrong set of women. Yes, Kathy, exactly. Red-handed Gladstone. I'll talk about that a bit at the end if I get time. So Annie Besant interviewed them in 1888. Stoke Park is in Buckinghamshire, Helen, and she found out she's heard that working class women in the East End are very exploited. You think she'd know that living there. But she hears about Matchwomen and she thinks, okay, I'll go down to that factory. I'll speak to some of the girls coming off shift and I'll ask them, you know, how bad are things really for you? And she finds out that things are terrible, like really, really Dickensianly bad. Wages are lower in 1888 than they had been 10 years previously. Now, look at that house. Do you think they needed to push wages down? They did not. I think we can safely say, you know, you haven't got to be ultra left to say that. They did, because by then they're a company, they're a firm, so they've got shareholders, and you know, you've got to buy the shareholder a new yacht. Did they have yachts in those days? Yes, they did, I think. So they push wages down for absolutely no reason. And Annie Besant said, when you look at the women, and you know, we saw that photograph earlier, you can see that written on their bodies. They're small and frail, even for East End working class women, because they are so malnourished. They told her that they also got fined completely unfairly, like wages are already low, and then the employers are illegally fining them for the slightest infraction, you know, for matches catching fire in the process. Well, guess what? Matches are pretty flammable. It's kind of their USP. It happens a lot, but they got fined for everything. So Bryant and May are taking even more money off them. And then if we can have the next slide, you probably heard in connection with the Matchwomen about phossy jaw. That's what they called it. Properly, phosphorus necrosis. This guy here was a dipper at Bryant and May in Fairfield Road. That's the most dangerous job because you're actually dipping the splints, the wood matches into the white phosphorus. And he's lost his lower jawbone. He's only a young bloke. It's had to be completely removed, and you can see from the diagram below, you can just about see like that was a jawbone, so that should have a full set of teeth in it, but it is completely decayed. And what used to happen was that they would go into work, they would have only probably a bit of bread. That's what working class girls lived on, bread and tea, perhaps to dip it in if they were lucky, fruit and veg, meat, very rare. They'd lay their bit of bread on their workbench. By the time they got to eat it, the white phosphorus particles in the air have given it a deadly seasoning. You're going to have missing teeth because there are no NHS dentists. I mean, there barely are now. So the poison, the white phosphorus fumes, really easy route into your jaw. And then you would start to spit out, while you were still alive, your own skeleton. And I just can't imagine how grisly and how appalling that must have been. bits of bone the size of peas would be working themselves out while you were still alive, because it's necrosis. Your tissue and your bones are dying away. Women would die, or they would end up with the only option. If I can have the next slide, this is so awful. It's only a drawing, but it's so awful. That was your plastic surgery, 1888 style. If you had fussy jaw and you managed to get out of the factory and survive it, all they could do really was cut away that dead flesh and screw in some really dodgy looking falsies. So that was it. And they told Annie Besant this, and she published her brief but very powerful expose. And I found out that what she did next was to let the employers know. So she sent them a telegram like, by the way, you might want to buy my paper, because she had her own political paper. On Thursday, there's going to be an article in there that you're going to find very interesting. So she's really letting them know that she's printed this expose. And they went completely ballistic. All their PR ruined. They bullied the workers. They tried to get the girls to sign a paper saying that Annie Besant had lied. And we can see a slide of Annie Besant next. Annie there, striking a pose. So they printed this paper. They said to the girls, you better sign that. That's a huge workforce, a couple of thousand people. So they printed out copy after copy of this. Sign your names under this to say that this journalist has lied. And this is the management. The management are very tough, the foreman, with the girls. They're known to be violent to them and sack them at the slightest whim. They've got no trade union by this stage, don't forget. So they would have expected to be sacked. So what they did is quite incredible. The foreman came back to collect these pre-prepared statements, and every single girl and woman had refused to sign. And the reason for this always really touches me, because they wrote a letter to Annie Besant telling her why they'd done this. And they said, my dear lady, they are trying to get the poor girls to sign a paper saying that you lied. But you didn't. We really appreciate you standing up for us. We will never go back on you, please be assured. And we hope you will not get into any trouble on our behalf, which always makes me get a bit tearful, because that's solidarity, isn't it? That's sisterhood. And yet we're supposed to believe that these people were too ignorant, too working class, too Irish, believe it or not, too everything to possibly have any political sus. But that is, to me, absolute solidarity. So Bryant and May then sack one girl as an example, supposedly, to the others. They make an excuse and sack her. But they really should have known better, because as soon as she walks out of the factory gates, so does everyone else. They lay down their tools, they pick up their hats, and they stream out onto the Fairfield Road, which very quickly is a massive picket line encircling the whole factory. It's a huge, huge factory. It's almost like a small village. Not only that, they obviously don't have Twitter or Facebook to publicise the fact they're on strike, but what they do is to parade the streets, singing songs about Bryant and May. Very rude, actually, songs about Bryant and May and how awful they are, to attract attention. So people come out onto their balconies and say, who the hell are you? And they're like, well, we're the Match Girls, as I'm sure you know, and we're on strike because of those bastards up the road. And people throw down money, which they catch in those long white aprons that we saw in the picture. And that's their first strike funds. I think it's quite brilliant. What we don't have is Annie Besant. And it's not until 2 days later that I found out from her diary that she was working and some Matchwomen came to see her. And she was quite offended. She heard a noise outside and she looked out and she said there was a rabble down on the pavement and they were blocking the road, and, you know, rich people were trying to get to work. She was quite appalled by this. A couple of them were allowed up to tell her what they wanted, and they told her they were on strike. Strike leader? Don't think so. They also were told by her to go back to work. She published in her paper that it was a mistake. It was really silly. They should have let a few girls be sacked, because that could have been sorted out. You know, the middle class socialists could have sorted that out. But what they couldn't cope with was 1,400 women on strike. The girls will go back to work, she wrote in her next edition. No, they would not, and they did not. What they did was march to Parliament, meet with MPs, hold mass meetings, get incredibly well covered in the local and national media of the day, until share prices tumbled. Oh dear. Bryant and May, hoisted by their own petard of capitalism, and were forced into a really, really angry acquiescence to all the women's terms, which, by the way, the women negotiated themselves. They went in and met with Bryant and May and put their terms. Some male trade unionists in the area offered to help, but Bryant and May wouldn't listen to them. To their amazement, they were like, but we're gentlemen, top hats on the table, surely they'll listen to us. No, but the workers managed to negotiate. So they managed to get better rates of pay. They managed to get a dining room built, a dining room and social club built across the road so they could eat out of the fumes of white phosphorus. And most importantly for us, they formed the largest union of women and girls in the country. And then only influenced just about everybody else. The dock strike of 1889, as I said, it's really contentious historically, connecting the Matchwomen to that, because historians wanted to say that was the start of the modern trade union movement. That's the start of political trade unionism. No influence from the Matchwomen. Well, I found out that was really nonsense. The dockers wrote to the Matchwomen when they heard about their victory and basically said, can you please come and help us? Can you advise us? How do we do what you did? That was amazing. You went on strike, you formed a union. Can't believe it. You've had a victory over one of the biggest, most successful employers in the country. Come and tell us how you did it. The dockers leaders wrote in their autobiographies. They were very generous. They said, it was the Matchwomen, obviously, obvs. They went on strike. We did what they did. And there was a mass wave of strikes throughout the country that was the start of everything we know today, that was the start of political trade unionism. So if we can fast forward through 1, 2, 3, if we can get to blue plaque strike picture. Should be there. No. Keep going. That's it. Thank you very much. That blue plaque was put up in very good faith by local people, but it was the bane of my life. Everything that I was trying to teach about and write about is contradicted. The Match Girl strike, look at that tiny print, of 1888 was led by Annie Besant. Oh, no, it wasn't. That's a plaque for Annie Besant, and that's on the wall of the factory. So it took me about 25 years, but if I can have the next slide. Eventually, the year before last, we finally got that strike up on the factory wall instead that says the Match Girls strike took place here. And one of the other things I teach in schools, I teach at the drop of a hat anywhere I can about this story because we have so much to learn from it. But I also have a little festival once a year, pretty much in the shadow of the Match Factory in Bow. And if I can have the final slide, if you can all join me next year at Bow Arts on the Bow Road, 28th of June. That'd be wonderful to see you. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Louise. That was incredibly interesting. I have heard you speak before, but it's the focus on just pushing aside that idea that women could not organise themselves and that it always had to be someone coming in from the outside. I mean, how many of us have run strikes ourselves, and it's always some sort of outside agitation, isn't it? You can't
always
be the workers themselves. So that rings very true, even though it's well over 100 years ago, 150 years ago. So brilliant introduction. We'll go to questions now, if that's okay.
Yes.
If people have got questions, please can you pop them in the Q&A, and then I think I can see them all come up here. The first one we've got, Louise, if you're all right to go straight in.
Yeah, go for it.
Labour behind the label. And
brilliant.
They're asking, was the idea that Annie Besant was the strike instigator around when she was still alive and active? Did she ever address that herself?
Yeah, Yes, really good question. And yes, she absolutely did. And the first time she addressed it was during the strike itself, actually. She was writing to the Times about the conditions the women faced and why they were on strike. And she was really important. You know, she was eventually important doing PR for the Matchwomen, but my God, she had to be dragged, kicking and screaming somewhat into it. And she operated what we might call the shaggy defence. It wasn't me. She said consistently throughout the strike and afterwards, I was not there. I've had it put to me that I was involved in the strike. I want to be clear. I was not there. I was nowhere near it. It wasn't me. I wasn't there. I didn't do it, Your Honour. So she's really, really keen. She thinks it's a dreadful idea. And she's very keen to disassociate herself with it, which is so interesting, isn't it, as someone memorialised as a strike leader. And she did stay involved in the Matchwomen's Union, but not for very long, because she was soon off to become a religious leader, basically. She became a theosophist, which I don't know if anybody knows, but it was kind of a slightly new agey, slightly Scientology-ish religion. So she soon left trade unionism behind and gone on to that.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, next up we've got a question about the role of the already organised women's trade union movement in 1988, and specifically the Women's Trade Union League. Is there any?
Yeah. Yes, they were run a bit ragged by the Matchwomen. They weren't initially involved. Oh, I should have said, actually, this is really important. It's a very quick strike. It was only a couple of weeks. So to be fair, there's not a lot of time for the organised movement to really get involved, you could say. But the Women's Trade Union League were absolutely driven to distraction by the Matchwomen, because the Matchwomen didn't give up. Just having formed the largest union of women girls in the country, you know, that's just the start as far as they're concerned. So they keep agitating and they keep meeting with other women, dockers' wives and jam makers and fur pullers and confectionery makers and all the local women. They want to have meetings with them. They want to say, look, girls, you can do this too. You should get involved with trade unionism. And there's a rather harassed sounding, you know, enthusiastic but rather harassed sounding account from the Women's Trade Union League going, the Matchwomen have been on to us again, and we've had to book another meeting, and it's all a bit exhausting. We've had to try and find a venue, and we all know what it's like, right, trying to get a good venue, and they wanted Irish music and dancing, and so we had to do that, and they wanted cakes and tea. And I thought, how brilliant that they wanted Irish music and dancing. And it's that actually that gave me the idea for the Matchwomen's Festival. So yes, they were involved, but really, it's astonishing the extent to which this is just the Matchwomen leading, dragging other people in, getting help where they can, using their resources. But this really is working class led.
Brilliant, thank you. Next up from Pete, did any of them go on to become suffragettes?
Yes, well, I say yes, not proved. Because I've never yet managed to get the money to go and research this. It is my dream. It is my dream to do this one day. I would be absolutely flabbergasted if they didn't. I think it's almost impossible that they didn't. And one of the reasons I think it was impossible was because when Sylvia Pankhurst comes to live in the East End, she says every woman in this street, very poor working class street, is already a suffragette. Not because of me, not because I'm here. They're all suffragettes apart from one woman. There was one holdout who was like, nah, not for me. Everyone else was already a suffragette. Of course they were. Why wouldn't they be? Why wouldn't they realise that women's liberation was pretty key for them? These are all very political people. History doesn't happen in the way it's taught, that, you know, you're involved in one thing and you're just the Matchwomen and then you just give up after that and that's it, and then you're just the suffragettes. Of course it doesn't, does it? If you're political, you stay political generally, don't you? Unless you get completely burnt out. And the movements bleed into each other. So I've been told anecdotally of Matchwomen who were suffragettes. I've yet to prove it. I was also told anecdotally, and tremendously excited by this because I'm a very passionate anti-fascist as well, that one of the Matchwomen at least was an anti-fascist, and I would imagine that they or their daughters would have been at Cable Street in 1936. Pretty sure.
Thank you. From Grace, did the women themselves refer to what they were doing as a strike?
Yes. Yes, they absolutely did. And it wasn't their first strike. And people sometimes think, and you can understand it, that perhaps this was the first strike by women or the first strike even, because you might think strike matches, that perhaps that's where the word comes from, but it's much older actually, and it comes from the print trade. This wasn't even the first strike by this group of women. I found evidence that they'd been on strike fairly regularly, definitely before this. And there was a strike in 1884 about Fossey Jaw, actually, so they were well aware of that. And there was one for the 8-hour day as well. The 8-hour day was a huge demand of the working class at this time. And I think it's Tom Mann who writes about them going on strike for that. So yeah, this is a politicised group, and yes, they definitely called it a strike.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions which are more about books and media, so perhaps we'll come to those at the end, and we'll keep on the sort of history, if that's all right.
Sure.
So Charlotte's asking, and well, actually, if I take Charlotte and it says David and Helen Thomas, so I'm sure we can cover both. If we take both those questions together, so because they're on the same sort of subject.
Yeah.
So, Charlotte's asking what the long-term outcome for the Matchwomen was. Did they manage to maintain their union organisation?
Yeah.
And David and Helen are asking about similar sort of thing. Did any of them lose their jobs? Was there victimisation longer term?
Yeah, you might, taking the last one first, you might think so, mightn't you, that the employers would fight back, because we know that in new unionism, hundreds of new unions are formed, but employers do start striking back. And some of them fall, some of them go by the wayside. But actually, the Matchwomen's didn't. It was still going in 1920 when it was absorbed into the GMB. So really, it never, ever finished when a lot of these unions did go to the wall. They kept going with it. They had other strikes and other organisations as well. They didn't lose their jobs because they stayed so strong. And in fact, they stayed so strong that the women who had been the strikers, as the years go by, the women who are left working there still, who were strikers, are like the cool gang. I was like, oh, they were on strike in 1888. They're like, wow. So they really recognised the importance of this. What used to happen, apparently, I found this out because I interviewed descendants. I was so lucky to get them while they were still with us, really, people who'd known the Matchwomen. And they said that what used to happen was that new girls would start working in the factory, and Bryant and May would try and pay them less than the rates that had been agreed, because they'd do it individually and just, oh, here you go, no need to talk to anyone else about your wages. But the strikers, the ones who were there in 1888, would go up to them and go, come on then, what they're paying you, show us. No, that's not right. No, go back, tell them, no. Tell them they got to pay you more. So they held so strong that, far from being victimised, the employers didn't even dare to deviate from the terms of the strike. This is all because of them. I can't emphasise this enough. And they're very typical of working class women elsewhere in the country, elsewhere in the world, elsewhere in history. They are this strong, strong friendship group. They do not leave a girl behind. They bring their traditions of friendship and solidarity from, poor women in the slums of the East End. That's how you stay alive, this network of women really keeping you alive. They bring that into the factories. And the absolute loyalty to one another and to the union, really, really impressive and not uncommon. Actually, there's been work done, and it's been found that women tend to be more loyal to unions and more loyal to strikes and stick out on strike actually longer, if anything, than male workers do, and they're very typical of that. Oh, the union was called the Union of Women Matchmakers.
Okay, I'm going to scoot around some of the questions now. And ones that kind of go together. Yeah. So from Gavin and Callum, there's a question around what support did they get from men?
Yeah.
And I suppose specifically men in the community, but also the wider trade union movement, but also kind of the flip side to that, did they then influence TUC, London Trades Councils, and the existing labour movement bodies at the same time?
Yeah. I'm just putting my email, by the way. in the chat because somebody mentioned about speaking, and yes, please hit me up. Always really happy to come and speak for organisations. Yes, they were quite well supported by their families. They're a very tough group of women because they had to be, because life was so extremely hard. And their husbands and sons and friends seem to have had a very healthy respect for them. So they did get support, and we know this because it really outraged the local press that in the early days of the strike, the women were parading the streets constantly when they were on strike, parading the streets of Bow, singing these songs like "We're going to hang old Brian on a sour apple tree," which obviously is not a TUC approved method of arbitration. And they were accompanied, the press said, by men of the very worst type, which means working class, basically. So yeah, they had community support. And although we see misogyny and sexism, of course we do, in the working class, we see it everywhere, we also see a surprising amount of solidarity. It doesn't take much to realise that you and your missus have the same problems and the same issues and are on the same page, and everyone has to work and struggle and make money together, or nobody does well. So yeah, really well supported. And in fact, the police said as well, when Annie Besant said they'll go back to work, local police were like, no, you don't know these women, you must be kidding. As long as there's one Matchwoman out on strike, trust me, they're all out on strike. They are not going back. So yeah, a lot of community support, probably couldn't have done it without. And then they go on to support the dock strike, by the way, as well. There's a lovely account of the victory procession of the great dock strike of 1889 that describes Matchwomen like a moving rainbow, because they're wearing these beautiful multicoloured hats and bright, beautiful clothes that are advancing like a moving rainbow in support of the dockers. And yes, we do then see members of the Matchwomen's Union appearing at the Trades Union Council at the TUC. Not terribly happy, some of the boys in the Trade Union Congress, I'm afraid to say, about that. You know, we had men like Henry Broadhurst, the parliamentary secretary, who said that the role of trade union men was to ensure that their wives and daughters should be in their proper sphere at home, not being forced to compete amongst the great and good men of the world for labour. And that's just a really typical angel in the house, domestic ideology, Victorian view. We shouldn't be surprised to see it. But these men who are not so much political or socialist as believing they can raise themselves, and, you know, if we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, maybe others can do the same, but we have to do it by respectability, by being like the middle classes, you know, by being respectable gentlemen of labour and having our ladies at home like the aristocrats have. Our ladies should be at home, not working in factories. Did that answer it okay?
Yeah, I think that covered it very well. So the next few are about lessons for today. So we've got Alan, who is drawing comparisons with equal pay strike at Ford's.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Women and wasn't initially fully supported, perhaps by the union more widely. And then it's questions around both just generally what you think lessons are for today. Yeah. And also Steve is asking to comment on corporate greed. And whether we're in a similar position now. You know, you said that they didn't need to make the level of profit they were, but of course they were trying to squeeze everything they could out of the So has anything changed in that respect?
Yeah, well, taking the last one first, it has changed, but then it's just gone back, hasn't it? Over the years since 1888, we've seen advances of the working class, haven't we? We've seen advances of you know, socialist ideas like the National Health Service. And then we've seen everything go back because, well, I mean, you know, you're not going to be surprised at me telling you that it's because we live and labour within a capitalist society. And as long as we do that, we're always going to be the enemy. Anything that frightens people's money, which pay rises and decent working conditions do, is always going to be fought back against, isn't it? And we've had again, you don't need me to tell you that we've had 14 years of a vicious Tory government. We had people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, who seems to think he is a Victorian capitalist gentleman, saying that we need to go back to the Victorian days when benevolent, kindly employers looked after their workers because there were no nasty trade unions in the way. This is one of the uses of the Matchwomen strike historically. You can prove it. You can say, really, so you think things were better before trade unions? Let's have a look, shall we? Let's, roll back the tape and let's have a look at the rotten jaws and the starvation and the women who were not menstruating because they were too starved as children. They were so malnourished, they weren't getting their periods. Let's have a look at what it was really like without trade unions. Very rich employer, Jacob. So the trickle down, what is trickling down? Absolutely nothing is trickling down. So we are always going to be pushed back there, aren't we? We are always going to be pushed out there unless we fight. We are always going to have to fight. We're never going to we'll get concessions, of course, if we get a good left-wing-ish government, but that will always be pushed back. And now we face such frightening populism, don't we? And such a frightening swing to the right and the far right all across Europe. Everything has moved so far to the right. And now we're saying, aren't we, we need to send job coaches into psychiatric wards. Get those people back to work. It's very Victorian. The NHS, we know what's happened to the NHS and we know why. And we're back to the days, you hear stories about people trying to treat themselves, people pulling their own teeth out. This is what used to happen in the Victorian period. So sadly, we're going to have to fight like hell for our National Health Service. We're going to have to fight like hell for everything. And that is one of the messages of the Matchwomen. And the biggest message, I suppose, is just one of sisterhood and solidarity. You are stronger together. They outside they knew that they were regarded as the scum of the earth. People said that about them because some of them were Irish, some of them were Jewish, some of them were Protestant. They were all EastEnders, which was a mark against you. They were all women working, which respectable women weren't supposed to do, and working in factories, which was terrible because you were working alongside men. So obviously, it's a great, you're all partying and having some sort of mass orgy, aren't you, in the match factory, in the minds of the Victorian middle classes. But they're absolutely clear that inside the factory, we stick together. The divides outside between Jewish people and Irish people and Catholic people could be strong. They could be strong. They could also not be in the working classes because they could also stand together well. But in the factory, there seems to be this mentality, in here, you're a match girl. Doesn't matter what people say about you outside or what your family's got or what your family hasn't got or where you come from. We all stick together. We do not listen to the bosses. We do not ever stab each other in the back, and we absolutely stand strong. And this was reflected even in their styles and fashions. They wore clothes that really annoyed the middle classes, which is partly why they did it. They had their own styles. People said, oh, they're Matchwomen. They wear little high-heeled boots, which was a bit sexy, suspiciously sexy. And they wear these huge, great hats, which are brash and colourful, and oh my goodness, and they wear brass hoop earrings, and trashy. They were visible. And you weren't supposed to be visible if you were poor. You were supposed to be not seen and not heard, shrink along in the shadows in beige if you can. But they were like, no, we are proud of who we are. And we see the whole East End thing, don't we? The shame of being an East Ender, revalorised, as academics call it, turned back on itself, and we get sort of Cockney pride and East End pride. The Matchwomen are really early with that. We will not be ashamed. We know what you're saying about us. We know how you're condemning working class women. We will not be ashamed. And grandchildren told me, Granny would always say, hold your head up high. Put your shoulders back, stand up straight and look anyone in the eye. You are the equal of anyone. And they absolutely believed that. And, they had to. The way they were treated, they had to give themselves dignity. They had to give themselves pride and acknowledgement. And they had to give themselves power. So they weren't listening to the message that you are powerless, scum of the earth, slum lasses. Oh, what are you ever going to do in life? They would just completely and utterly ignore all of that Victorian ideology, which is incredibly strong. They completely ignore it and they say, no, we are powerful. And we know where our power lies, in our numbers, in our voices, in our solidarity, in our strength. So the big thing that people don't want us, you and me, to know is that there are more of us. Everything, the way history is taught as great individuals, everything about society, it's like, be an individual, no such thing as society, don't look around you, don't turn around and notice that there's millions of people like you exactly where you are. No. Look up, try and be a celebrity or an influencer, or what are the royals doing? You know, don't think about your class, don't identify with your class, because that, you know, uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. They know that once we realise the big secret that there is an awful lot more of us and they're only there on our say-so and with our permission, things get a bit scary, don't they, for the elite? And the Matchwomen busted that. They knew that. And they knew it because of their Irish heritage. They knew it because they were already political. They were involved in marches for Irish Home Rule. They were already self-educating frantically when they could. And yeah, I think that kind of answered everything, didn't it? They absolutely believed in making their own identities. No one's going to tell us from the top down who we are. We know who we are.
I think that more than answered it. I think you all pretty much have answered the question I was going to go to next. So I'll just give you a chance to add anything if you wanted to. But it was about the fact that many of the women were Irish, and also about whether they were related directly to the Dockers, who then came out.
Yes, they absolutely were. And that was one of the things that I found so interesting when I did my research, because my essay that I started in about, 1997, of course I was only about 10, which turned into eventually, you know, a master's degree and a PhD, which from leaving school at 15 was a bit of a head spinner, and then a book, and then a festival, and then I discovered that I've completely forgotten what the question was.
What's that relationship with the Dockers? And
Thank you. I discovered that they were absolutely related, and that was really important for me to prove, because people were saying, historians would say things like, well, there's a year between the big dock strike and the Matchwomen strike. Actually, there was a mini dock strike a few months after their victory. And they're too different from the men who became new unionists. They're too different from the dockers. And I thought, well, too different. Okay, so I started looking at the census. I didn't used to wear glasses. I swear my eyesight went looking at the handwriting, the Victorian handwriting on the censuses of the day. And look at this. We have Matchwomen and Dockers, not just in the same areas, in the same houses. So they're husbands and wives, they're mums and sons. And actually you can read commentators of the day saying, in a very patronising way, but saying, Matchwomen and Dockers always date and they tend to marry. And of course they would, because, you know, a lot of them are Irish. They have the same traditions. They go to the same churches. They go to the same pubs. They go to the same kind of musical nights and cultural events. So, of course, it would be really weird, wouldn't it, if they weren't related? And yet, that's how history was taught for more than a century. Separate group of new unionists, dockers, gas workers, men doing man things and good, sensible, striky things. And then some women did a thing, but they're just a separate, completely separate group. And they just accidentally went on strike because some posh lady told them to. Completely, you know, cordon that off from the rest of the movement. And of course, you know, it's absolute nonsense. And some of the descendants I met told me, yeah, my gran was married to a docker, or yeah, her brother was a docker, or yeah, absolutely. Couldn't get two more connected communities, actually.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to try and weave a couple of questions together again. Are you okay to keep going, Louise?
For days, if necessary.
You can't tell you're enthusiastic about this topic. It doesn't come through.
No, I know it doesn't. Low key.
So we've got a question about hidden strikes. So Pete, this is from, as mentioned, a big strike of miners in Durham.
Yeah.
By the toll puddle, you know, and he's asking were there similar strikes by women elsewhere in the country around this time. which kind of
Yes.
links to the next question from Louise, which was the strike a defining moment for the trade union movement?
Yeah.
And if you can also cover off from Alan, he's asking around, was it a really important part of the move away from craft unionism towards general unionism, and away from, he puts it, the idea of respectable trade unions?
Yes.
So if you can kind of cover it, I know that's quite a lot there, but.
Oh no, this is all brilliant. I love talking to trade unionists. It's such you get such brilliant questions. I've done talks for other groups. I once accidentally did a group for people who turned out to all be Tories. Oh, it was terrible. So this is wonderful. Yes. Strikes by women have actually gone on for a very long time. I discovered a militant women's trade union in Lancashire in 1788, 100 years before the Matchwomen, to my glee and amazement, who were known for being very militant as well. And actually you can find accounts of women going on strike, sometimes not in a unionised way, like they weren't organised in unions, but they still went on strike. I mean, of course, we have strikes. I think the first strike attested to is in ancient Egypt. I think it's people building the tombs who went on strike in ancient Egypt. So, of course, when people have only one weapon, and that's to withdraw their labour, it's always happened. And women's strikes, you can find some really interesting accounts from the early 1800s of how terrified people were when women went on strike. It seems to have been a particular thing, like women did not play when they were on strike. And you get accounts like, well, the women strikers, we had to cross over the other side of the street because they were very scary and their language was just shocking, and they were being rude to passers-by, which you get about the Matchwomen as well, like, oh, terrible, run away and hide. And it tended to be the case, and I found this in many examples of women's strikes, that if you broke a strike against your sisters, or even if it was women who called it and you were a male worker, that was, should we just say, that was a poor idea. That didn't significantly increase your health. We have examples of people who broke strikes by women falling down wells. A bit clumsy, I suppose. And we have examples of strike breakers being dunked into water troughs and under water pumps as well. So it was not good for your health to strike break, which, I can get into really in a way. So yes, strikes by women, very, very common as strikes by men. I sat down when I was researching this with something I didn't even know existed, which is a record of all the strikes recorded in the country in the Times newspaper. And I was mind blown. Lots of strikes before the Matchwomen strike. And then after the Matchwomen strike, absolutely shoots up, like everybody is on strike, from the East End to Ireland. Women in Ireland write to the Matchwomen's Union and say, how did you do it? We want to go on strike. So, yeah, it's a much more common thing than we know. We're allowed to know about one or two big strikes, aren't we? Because it does frighten the establishment if we talk about this sort of thing too much. But they were just going on all the time. And yes, there were strikes by women all the time. And certainly after the Matchwomen strike, yeah, there were strikes all over the East End and beyond. Was it important in the union movement? Yeah, really vital. It changes, it's the turning point of a trade union movement where, as we've said, that the craft unions and what people call the labour aristocrats, the top of the tree, the best earning men, and it was men because skill was associated with male workers, so you could do the same work as a woman, it was unskilled. Man comes and does it, skilled, better paid. And the idea was that these people, by getting accommodations from the working classes and the establishment, by being super respectable and well behaved and losing their East End accents and dressing very well and pretending not to be working class at all, can win concessions. So there's your respectability politics. But there isn't, there are some unions that are not like that, like I'm simplifying vastly, but there are some very political unions, like, gosh, we can go back centuries for really political groups of people trying to change things. But on the whole, the established union movement is quite big on the respectability and on being gentlemen and having the women at home. And the Matchwomen and the new unionism movement that follows it, the Great Dock Strike onwards, absolutely drive a coach and horses through that. And suddenly they're saying, no, we're not just here for us. We're not just here to keep our labour price high. We're not just here to limit access to our professions through apprenticeships. We're not interested in that. We don't come from those jobs. We don't come from that place. We are right on the bottom tier here. We want to raise the class. We have a class consciousness. We want everyone to do well. But the Matchwomen going around trying to unionise every single woman worker who went near them for decades afterwards. We want to raise the class. We want to raise everybody up. And we are not interested in appealing to or appeasing the middle and upper classes. We are our own thing. We're the working classes, thank you very much. And we built this country. And we're going to have a bit of a slice of the pie, please. Did that answer everything?
I think so. Yeah, I'm sure people will let us know if we didn't, or if you didn't. There's a couple of ones relating to the sort of health and safety aspects. So one from Sheila about, you talked about separate canteens and things, but specifically did they win in terms of improvements, just health and safety immediately?
Yeah.
Another from Kathy about, do you think there was the relationship between the fact that it was a strike of women and it was around health and safety rather than traditional, I can't think of a better word, issues like pay? And if I can be cheeky and sort of throw my own question, just interested in your sort of views on, because also there were factory acts quite shortly after that. Do you think there was an influence on the ability of the campaigns around improving the law to win because of industrial action?
Again, really, really good questions. Health and safety. Right, so starting with, was it a strike over health and safety? And like, is that a more sort of, I suppose, woman's concern? It wasn't really a strike over health and safety. It was more a strike over management bullying, because what actually happened was the strike was forced upon them. They wouldn't sign this statement that said that Annie Besant had lied when she wrote about how terrible their working conditions are. So management sacked one of them and they all walked out in solidarity. So that was the real cause of the strike. And what they did was, as soon as they got outside, they were so organised. We'd be proud to see our members behaving like this today, right? They immediately have a vote, they elect 6 representatives, and they go back in and say to the management, right, while we're here, we want that girl reinstated. We want all of us who've walked out not to be victimised and to be allowed back. But while we're here, mate, we will also please have a separate dining room so we can eat out of the fumes of phosphorus, and we'll have a trade union, thank you very much, and we'll have better pay and conditions, and we'll have an end to the illegal fines you're imposing on us, and we will have the right to take our grievances over the head of the foreman, that's the ones who used to be quite violent to the women, straight to the directors, thank you very much. And Brian and May must have been apoplectic, like, who do you think you're talking to? How dare you? You are you're the lowest of the low. We are gentlemen, go away, get stuffed, you're all sacked. And they were like, all right then, okay, strike it is. But they were really organised, and the way they instantly ramped up their demands and had it all ready to go, we want this, we want this, we want this, we want this. So they got their separate dining room. That was really, really key. But they also really pushed and encouraged the move away from using white phosphorus. It was very slow in this country because Brighton and May didn't want to give it up. Basically, it's cheaper. There's a safe phosphorus, red phosphorus, expensive. So we were late in banning white phosphorus, but still quicker than I think we would have been without the Matchwomen, because they made it so onerous through their trade union and all the health and safety conditions that they and the wider union movement and factory acts and health and safety at work acts and factory inspectors, all of this together makes it so onerous to use white phosphorus. So many regulations that in the end Brighton and May are like, do you know what, just take your white phosphorus, we don't care, we've given up, we're over it. And they agree to move away from using it. They also get a dentist on site, because I talked about how phossy jaw affects your teeth. And rather than sacking people for phosphorus necrosis, they are supposed to compensate them and let them have dental help. Doesn't mean they don't still try it, because they do. There are still letters years later I found in the company's correspondence where people are saying, I got Fossy Jaw in your factory, and they're like, no you didn't, no you didn't, no you definitely got it somewhere else and you brought it in. We've never had a case of it. They're just lying through their teeth, because they have teeth, unlike some of the workers. So they still try it on, but it's made, you know, really much more difficult for them, just because of the pressure from the women. And yeah, the Factory Acts, it's impossible to overestimate really how much this did to change people's perception, even of working class women per se as a group. I mean, commentators have said, goodness, we thought working class women were just, I don't know, getting drunk and fighting each other and just, I don't know, having sex and wearing big hats. But now we see that actually this is, God, they're intelligent. They can form entire sentences. They're quite eloquent. They're political, they're disciplined. My God, they care about each other. They look after each other. They're almost like us, the middle classes. They're almost human. And it really changes the perception of health and safety, because people think, Bryant and May, look at that lovely factory. Look at how rich they are. Look at their matches everywhere. Look at the fact that they're Quakers. The original Mr. Bryant and Mr. May were Quakers. So, you know, generally better employers, right? So people are convinced that conditions must have been wonderful. And when they find out otherwise, it's really embarrassing for shareholders. A lot of them are clergymen and Liberal MPs, because Brighton and May is thought of as being quite a liberal, you know, quite a nice-ish employer. So all these people that have bought these shares are now being mortified and embarrassed. Their names are being printed, the shareholders' names are being printed, and people are going, oh, all right, Reverend, going on about the poor, are you? But I see you're making 20% profits out of rotting the jaws of working class girls. That's not very Christian, is it? So massively embarrassing. And it's those shareholders that then go to Bryant and May and go, for the love of God, please do something, because this is really embarrassing. So, yeah, it's hard to overemphasize, really, like how this just changes minds on so many levels about working class women and about safety at work.
Thank you, Louise. I can see that there's some sort of problem with the chat and
is there?
Some hacking nonsense going on. Just don't click a link and ignore it. It's some vile nonsense, but I don't think it's interrupting the Q&A people's ability to watch. So they're not doing very well on that. We'll look to wrap up fairly quickly, but there's another couple of questions on the sort of history, and then a few bits on more your book itself and media and things. So
sure.
So there's one question about, and I know you've covered some of this already, but please do elaborate if you can, Louise. About other women being organised in a similar way. Christine highlights that some of her ancestors were ostrich feather curlers,
excellent,
which is such a quality job title. And brush drawers and boot finishers.
Yeah.
And another one which isn't directly related, but if you can try coming together, is about any Matchwomen becoming involved in socialist politics, I suppose. Social Democratic Federation and that sort of thing at that time. If you could just cover those off, and then we'll do a few about just your book itself. And
sure. Yeah, so the SDF, the Socialist Democratic Federation, generally speaking, like most of the socialists really of the socialist revival, which is how this period is described, you know, it's pretty middle class, actually. And then you have the Fabian Society, which is Annie Besant. Annie Besant's in the Fabian Society and also in the SDF at times, because it's all, believe it or not, left-wing politics, a lot of splits and arguments. It wouldn't happen today, would it? So very middle class, the Fabian Society in particular, and they do not have an emphasis on wanting to organise people like this. It's hard to believe now, because we can't believe that any organisation that considers itself socialist would not be wanting to organise with working class people. But George Bernard Shaw, old GBS, who's a leading Fabian, you know, says we are successful because we are middle class. We organise and speak to the middle classes, and that's how we do things. And that's what Annie Besant was going to do with the strike. She never intended there to be a strike. What she wanted, and why she was writing an article and hoping Bryant and May would sue her and take her to court so she could then take a libel action and defend herself in court and talk about how awful these employers were. She wanted a consumer boycott. So she wanted a middle class to middle class solution to influence consumers, to get people to buy elsewhere. She absolutely never, ever wanted the Matchwomen to go on strike. And she was not uncommon at all for middle class socialists of the time in referring to people like the Matchwomen as the mob of labour. It sounds awful to us, but we have to remember this is the start of eugenics, and the idea that the poor are this mass of dangerous semi-criminal people who are dragging us all down, right? And now we have the far right and their great replacement theory. They had it then about working class people. They're outbreeding us. They're everywhere. They're breeding like rabbits. People wanted to stamp down on people like this, who they thought were irredeemable and dangerous. The mob, that's really the view. So a lot of groups like the SDF and the Fabians are not really interested in having working class members. We don't know too much about whether the Matchwomen were involved formally in socialism, but as I say, I suspect they stayed as involved as they could, bearing in mind most of these women stayed very, very poor. So they were working until they dropped, pretty much. They might be working at home, they might be doing piecework at home, they might be peeling onions for Cross and Brackwell, they might be making matchboxes at home, they might be still working in the factory, but they worked until they dropped. So there's not a lot, we don't see any of them become members of parliament, for example, later when it's possible for women to do that. So I don't know. I'm still working on it, and I still hope to find, more evidence of them being actively involved in the suffragette movement and the anti-fascist movement. I would imagine it's there. But it's yet to be proved. Other women being organised, yes, we have. Before this, we have women going on strike, not necessarily as members of unions, but just withdrawing their labour. And afterwards, we see a lot more female unions forming. And the feather trade, yes, really interesting luxury trade, but not as pleasant as it sounded. You could get a lot of lung conditions and diseases for working with the feathers that went on to adorn the house, the hats in the West End, in the sort of luxury milliners of the West End. But yes, women organised as best they could before this and definitely after it as well. It's a really inspiring moment, and it's not at all lost on other working class people that, this is the way we should do things. I feel like I missed something out there. Did I miss something out?
No, I don't think so. You covered about the socialist movement and other women, other unions, which are predominantly women. So that's great. I think now we'll just move on to, and I do apologise about the chat. I think it's been knocked out, so people just close it down.
Don't worry, it happens. It's fine.
So just more about the media side of things. So Kevin is asking about whether your book is available as an ebook and where might he get a copy. There was a question about whether the book traces the union after the strike.
Whether the book, what, sorry?
Traces the history of the union after the strike. Does it go into what happened post?
Yeah.
And then there was, the other one was about other media available, particularly audiobooks and documentaries that are worth watching around this subject.
Sure. Okay. No, there isn't an ebook yet, but I'm hoping that there will be. It's something that I'm working on, and I'm so pleased with the fact that people keep buying it. So it's in, I think it's 6th or 7th imprint, and that is thanks to trade unionists and working class people who bought it. It really is. And when I went to try and get it published, my publisher said, well, I don't think anyone's really interested in this, are they? I'm like, no, actually working class people do read. No, they really do. And the publishers tend to be quite posh, even today. Really? Fascinating. I said, yeah, I go around the country and I do talks, and sometimes I'll stay on someone's sofa, and, I always end up sitting up half the night reading their books because they've always got the most incredible collection of books. Working class people, trade unionists do read books. Women like books about women's history. Irish people like books about Irish history. And they were like, fascinating. They just thought, I think they thought working class people just read, I don't know, The Sun or something. So They've just been, they keep saying, my publishers, I can't believe this book is still selling. I can't believe we're having to reprint it. And I'm like, I told you people are interested in this stuff. It's difficult though, isn't it? Because publishers don't think people are interested in it because there haven't been many books about this kind of thing. So of course books like this haven't sold because books like this haven't been allowed to exist. So it's like this vicious circle. And I still get people saying now, it's a bit niche, isn't it? It's niche. And I say, well, the working class are not particularly niche. There's a lot of us, women, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of us. Irish people, Jewish people, lots of us. Trade unionists, working women, loads of us. And I say, you know, I often get asked to write books. Would you do a book about Queen Victoria, or would you do a book about like upper class women? I have no interest in doing that. If I ever wanted to make money, that is what I would have to do, and that's what a lot of historians do. They go on to write books about Queen Victoria. But I said, you know, people, you would bite my hand off if I said I'll write a book about Queen Victoria's, I don't know, sex life or something. And what is more niche than being a queen? There's one of them. There's literally one monarch. So how are you telling me that the working class is a niche? So there's a whole idea and culture that needs to change. So yeah, hoping for ebooks in the very near future. Does the book cover after the strike? Yes, it does. I write a lot about the dock strike because it's very important to connect the two. Otherwise, you've got a lovely story of women striking and it's great and it's very empowering and they go on to form a union. But it's so much more than that because they influence an entire movement, the whole new unionist movement. So you can kind of trace the whole modern trade union movement, really. Even the Labour Party, kind of, you know, its beginnings, part of it. This is a definite stepping stone on the way. So I wrote a lot about the dock strike. Yeah, I did a lot of research on the dock strike and about Matchwomen and dockers. Was that everything? Was there anything else?
Just other media, other...
Oh, right. No, I mean, not at this stage. I have been approached a few times about films and documentaries, but I don't want to sound like really, really fussy and really picky. They haven't wanted to do the sort of thing that I would want done. You know, can you do us like a film script, but can you put a duchess in it? Or, you know, was Queen Victoria involved in some way in the Matchwomen strike? No, she wasn't. She wasn't at all involved in the Matchwomen strike. And if I do it, I want to do it properly. I know it's ridiculous. And this is why I'm skinned. And other historians are loaded, but yeah, if it's done, I want to do it properly. But I mean, I always get nibbles, I always get people talking about it, but we'll see. I'd love to do it. I'd love there to be a documentary series on this and on other women activists. I mean, God, I've got stories, thanks to the Matchwomen, they opened up history so much for me. I have got hundreds of stories now of absolutely jaw-droppingly brilliant brave working class women and men, and you know, I'd love to see a series about that on the BBC or something, and occasionally there'll be a programme about it, but not much more than that so far. But I really, really hope there will be. It got covered in what's it called, Enola Holmes. It's a Netflix show, and they sort of did the Matchwomen, not like in the most brilliant way. And I did, I think, contact the producer, I think it was, and say, oh, I understand you're doing the Matchwomen. Did you want me to help in any way? And they were like, no, no, thank you. So, okay. So that story is out there. That's been quite good, though, because a lot of American school kids now know about the Matchwomen and contact me and say, oh, can you do a Zoom with us for our school or for our college or for our university or for like National History Day, which is a big thing in America. So it gets the story out there. But I think unless I'm willing to, or someone else decides to, you know, sort of sex up the Matchwomen or, you know, bring Queen Victoria into it, I still think, sadly, people are not as interested as they could be. Although, you know, people do write about it. It does get covered. It does get brought up in other people's plays and so on now. So, and there have been a few, I think there's a children's book about it now as well. And a novel as well. Someone read my book and wrote a novel about the women at Brian and May as well. So we're getting there slowly. We're getting them out there slowly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, certainly my experience of seeing it talked about on sort of TV documentaries and things is that it still takes the very Annie Besant centered.
Very hard, isn't it? We're so attached to that great individual thing, and you can push it. It's like weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. You can push down the great individual school of history, but it just comes back up. People are so attached to it being one individual. And to me, like when they did the plaque on the factory, they said, "Can we put up a couple of names of match women on it, English heritage?" And I said, no. Put the match girls. They were a group. That's what's so important about them. They had no leaders. They were a completely democratic group. And we have to get away from the idea that, we can only have the odd Joan of Arc or Mary Queen of Scots or Queen Elizabeth I or Queen Victoria. We can only have individual heroes and heroines, because that's so disempowering for the rest of us. And this is not how we get things done. We get things done with solidarity.
Louise, am I all right just to go back with one question? Really
sure, as many as you
like.
Well,
we need to wrap up next minute, but it's a really important one, so I don't want to ignore it. And
sure.
It's from Louise about the role of Black women and their exclusion from narratives around collective struggle, I think is. And if you could comment on that, and then lots of people asking about contact details and things, so we'll.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, don't let me forget to drop my email again. Yeah, something else that I'm really passionate about is the underrepresentation of Black women, of Muslim women, of disabled women, of LGBT. I mean, you name it, right? Women are barely represented in history anyway, apart from kings and queens. So it's something I'm really, really passionate about. And I try constantly to sneak these stories, believe me, they are out there, onto the BBC. And we know that as far as the suffragette movement goes, for example, we don't have a lot of detail about Black women being involved. They seem to have been very excluded in America. We know that was almost segregated. But Asian women, South Asian women were hugely involved in the suffragette movement, just starting to be said, I think, now, as were working class women. It wasn't just white middle class women by any means. And it's really important that we look more at that. And we have so many great and inspiring leaders in this country, Claudia Jones, you name it, Nora Nayat Khan, amazingly brave heroines and really important ones who were Black and were Asian and were Muslim. Really a load more needs to be done on that. Obviously myself, I'd love to write about it, but it wouldn't be right for me as a white person to write about it. But what I do try and do is bring writers like Dr. Caroline Bressie, who's written a lot about the organisation of Black women and Black people in Britain generally. I try to, I'll have them come talk at my Match Festival and try to boost that as much as possible, because it's not just working class people that are excluded. It is every bloody body who isn't essentially a white upper class English man who is still to this day massively excluded from history. And our historians now, David Starkey seems to have just about cancelled himself now, thank God, after being racist, misogynistic and homophobic for absolutely years. But, Dan Snow, lovely bloke. But we do have an awful lot of white bloke, upper class historians still, don't we? We seem to think that, people call Boris Johnson a historian, so, I despair. I call him a lot of other things. But yeah, there's a great deal of work to be done. There was another question and I haven't written it down. I can't read it.
No, it was just moving on really, because we're going to have to.
Contact details.
Finish up. It's about contact details. What's the best way of getting hold of you?
Yes, I would suggest probably email me. I'm also on Twitter, but I quite often just having rows with fascists and racists on there. But my email is Louise Raw. That's all one word. So that's LOUISERAW at hotmail.co.uk, not .com, .co.uk, one of the really old addresses. And yeah, drop me a line on that, and I'm always really happy to come and speak or whatnot. And hope to see you all 28th of June next year, Matchwomen's Festival. Love to see some of you there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. That was when you see I was asked very last minute to do this. I thought, oh, an hour and a half on a Zoom meeting, that might be stretching
Oh,
people.
sorry. Yeah.
No,
Bad luck.
not at all, not at all. It's flown by because yeah, genuinely because of the huge passion. You talk about this. It's we could go on easily for another hour. I think.
Mm,
I think
mm.
there'd be a lot more you could say.
Well,
We
they're
could
such
learn.
inspiring women, and they really changed my life, and they really, they inspire me, and I've really learned from them and lots of women like them. So I'm very grateful and appreciative to them and to you for letting me talk about them.
No, you're very welcome, and I do want to thank actually the people asking questions. Not only have we had really insightful questions, interesting questions. There's been some nice anecdotes in there. One about a vicar's son getting his toes nicked during a miners' strike. That was a good one. I like that.
Really? Oh,
Yeah, and
fantastic.
another one that you should drag Ken Loach out of retirement to make the film.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to. I
Got a
really
bit
would love to.
of,
Yeah, it
got
needs someone like that, doesn't it? It really does
that.
need someone like that.
Yeah, go for it. That would be something. Yeah. Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. That was really interesting. A really good way to spend an evening. I do, and I have been asked just to go through a few things. So this session is part of the GFTU's Educational Trust Program, and it's free, as you can tell. But if you can support radical independent trade union education for the whole movement, then do think about becoming a friend of the Educational Trust. I think it's been put in the chat if that's still usable about how you do that. If you just Google friend of GFTU Educational Trust, I'm sure it will come up as the top one. People were talking about the Dagenham strikes, the Grunwick strikes in the questions. They are covered in future sessions, which are monthly at 7. The next one coming up is Kathy Hunt, and she's talking about the chain makers.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, that would be great.
And that's on the 21st of November. So 7 p.m. 21st of November. Right, I think that's everything for this evening. I just want to thank you one more time, Louise. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your brilliant questions. That was so interesting. I really enjoyed it.
It's always good when you got a bunch of people who clearly
Who gets it?
they get it. They know what it is about. They're involved in the movement and they can see the similarities and they can understand the sorts of things that they can picture.
Yeah.
The events and things. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.